I have kept records for 900 years, and I have learned that the most dangerous thing in any archive is a date, not a name. Names can be argued, not a claim, however large. A claim can be tested, weighed, set beside other claims and made to behave. A date is different. A date does not negotiate. It sits at the head of an entry like a stone at the head of a grave, and either it is true or the whole world around it is wrong. In the vaults of keeping, we are taught early to distrust our own astonishment, because astonishment is how a young keeper talks himself into believing a date must be a mistake. I was astonished once when I was young. I am not young now, and I no longer believe the date is a mistake. That is the worst thing I can tell you, and I am going to tell you everything else first, so that you will understand why. We are the sail. We do not build particularly. We do not fight particularly. We do not spread across the dark the way the bright young powers spread, burning through systems the way a fire crosses dry grass. We keep. That is the whole of us. Before there were treaties between the great houses of the galaxy, there were keepers to witness them. Before there were borders, there were keepers to mark where one people's memory ended and another's began. We are slow, and we are long-lived, and we are patient in the particular way that water is patient with stone, and the vaults of keeping are the oldest continuous thing that any living species can point to and say, "This was here before us," and it remembers what we have forgotten. The vaults are not a building. People who have never come to us imagine a hall, perhaps a library, perhaps a temple with rows of cases under cold light. The truth is closer to a mountain that was hollowed slowly from within, level descending below level, each level older than the one above it, so that to walk down through the vaults is to walk backward through time itself. The upper levels are bright and busy. Petitioners come there. Envoys come there to lodge a record or to consult one, to settle a dispute over an old boundary by reading what was written when the boundary was new. The upper vaults smell of warm stone and the oil we use on the older media, and there is always the low sound of keepers moving, the soft friction of robes, the click of a seal being set, the particular hush that a great many quiet people make together. But you go down. You go down past the level of the treaties, past the level of the first contacts, past the level where the records stop being written by hands we can name and start being written by hands we only suppose. The light grows colder. The air grows still. The sounds of the upper vaults fall away behind you until you can hear your own respiration and the faint complaint of the stone settling, which it has been doing for longer than there have been ears to hear it. And at the bottom, below everything, below the oldest treaty and the oldest map and the oldest grief any species has thought to set down, there is a sealed level we call the underseal, and in the underseal there is one entry that should not be there. I have spent my life in the lower vaults. It is not a posting that is given to the ambitious. The ambitious want the upper halls, where the living come and the work has consequences you can see in your own lifetime. The lower vaults are for those of us who are content to be the hinge between what was and what will be, who do not need our work to be witnessed in order to do it well. I was content. I want you to understand that before the rest. I was content for 800 years. I tended the cold entries. I renewed the seals when the medium beneath them showed the first hairline of age. I copied, when copying was permitted, with a hand I had trained until it could reproduce a stroke laid down 100,000 years before mine and leave no seam. I was a good keeper of dead things, and I asked the dead things nothing, and they told me nothing, and we were at peace. The blank sector was simply part of the world to me, the way a mountain is part of the world to the people who live in its shadow. Every chart we held, and we held charts older than any cartographer's guild now standing, left one region of the sky unmarked. Not unexplored, unmarked. There is a difference, and it is the whole of this account. An unexplored region is a region no one has reached. Its blankness is an absence of knowledge, and a blank like that invites you in, the way an empty page invites a hand. The region I am speaking of was not blank that way. Around its edge the charts were dense, crowded, almost frightened in their detail. Every nearby star named 3 times over, every approach marked, every margin annotated in the cramped hand of cartographers who clearly could not stop writing. And then, at a certain line, the writing stopped. Not because the knowledge stopped, because the knowledge was deliberately withheld and the withholding itself was recorded, generation after generation, hand after hand, each keeper before me having decided that the right thing to pass on was not what lay inside that line, but the fact that one did not go to find out. We called the region the Stillward. I do not know who named it. The name is older than the Sale word for it. It survives in tongues that have no speakers left, in scripts we can read but not pronounce, always the same shape of meaning. The still place, the place that does not answer, the ward you keep against rather than the ward you keep within. Among the bright young powers, who do not know our word and would not respect it if they did, it had 100 names, most of them braver than they should have been. They called it the dead quarter. They called it the long dark. They called it, when they were feeling expansive, the last unconquered sky, as though it were a thing waiting for a conqueror rather than a thing that had outlasted every conqueror who ever turned an eye toward it. They did not know what I knew. To be fair, neither did I, not then. I knew only the date. The entry sits at the floor of the underseal, beneath a stone that takes 4 of us to move, on a medium I will not describe to you because the description is itself a kind of key, and I have sworn not to turn it. It is brief. The oldest entries are always brief. Brevity is the natural voice of things that expect to be read across an unimaginable gulf of time and have learned to waste no word. It names the Stillward. It marks the region as closed, not dangerous, not contested, not quarantined for some passing plague, but closed, in the absolute grammar the oldest keepers used when they meant a thing should never be reopened. And it gives the closure a cause. It says that the closure was made against the inhabitants of that region, and it describes, in the spare and terrible way of the oldest hands, what those inhabitants did to merit the closing. And it is dated, that is the thing. That is the whole of the thing. It is dated, in the long reckoning that the underseal uses, which measures time not in the small revolutions of one world around one sun, but in the great slow turning of the galactic core, a reckoning so vast that an entire civilization's rise and fall occupies less of it than a breath occupies a life. And by that reckoning the entry is old. It is older than the sale. It is older than the keeping. It is older than the homeworld I was born on, older than the star that warms it. I have stood over that entry with the records of the sky spread around me, the astronomers' tables and the deep surveys, and the slow, patient measurements of how the heavens have drifted, and I have set the entry's date against the history of the region it names, and I have found the thing that I was content for 800 years not to find. When that entry was made, when the oldest keeper of all set down the warning against the inhabitants of the Stillward and closed the region against them for all time, the Stillward had no inhabitants. It had no worlds that could bear them. It had no star to warm such worlds. By the long reckoning of the underseal, at the moment the warning was written, the matter that would one day become the human sun had not yet drawn itself together out of the dark. The warning is older than the thing it warns of. The record knew before there was anything to know. I told no one. For 200 years I told no one. I want that understood, because what came after has been laid at my feet by some in the keeping who think I should have spoken sooner, and by others who think I should never have spoken at all, and I have come to believe that both are wrong, and that the timing of my speech changed nothing, because the entry was never mine to control and never theirs. But for 200 years I carried it alone, and I renewed its seal with my own hand, and I told myself the thing every keeper tells himself when he finds something he cannot bear, that it was not his to decide. The Stillward was closed. My duty was to keep it closed. The why of it was a stone at the bottom of a well, and a keeper does not need to drink from the well to know how to guard it. So I guarded it, and I was no longer content, but I was disciplined, and for a long time those are difficult to tell apart from the outside. It was the Ior who ended that. The Ior ascendancy was young the way a flame is young, all height and heat and the conviction that the dark exists to be pushed back. I do not say this with contempt. I have watched many young powers rise, and most of them I have admired. In the cold way we admire things we expect to outlast. The Ior were better than most. They were curious without being cruel, which is rarer than it sounds. They wanted to know things genuinely and not merely to own them. They had crossed a great deal of sky in a short time, by our reckoning, and they had done it with a competence that the old houses found alarming, and that I, privately, found almost beautiful. They reminded me of nothing so much as a tide coming in, patient and inevitable and entirely without malice, and certain to reach the line on the beach above which the wise do not build. They came to the keeping with a petition, which was correct of them. Most young powers do not bother with the keeping. They regard us as a museum, a curiosity, a slow old order with no fleet and no claim, and nothing to enforce its judgments but the weight of having been right for longer than anyone else has existed. The Ior were more thoughtful. Their envoy was a young one named Resh Talavar. I will give her name, because she behaved with honor throughout, and what happened was not her doing. And she came down into the upper vaults with a retinue smaller than her station permitted, which I noted and respected, and she laid her petition before the keeping with her own hands. The petition was simple and it was reasonable, and that was the horror of it. The Ior wished to chart the stillward. They had grown, they said, until the unmarked region sat athwart their natural expansion, the way a closed door sits athwart a hall. They were not asking to conquer it, or to settle it, or to take anything from it. They were asking only to look. They had read in the records that any petitioner may read, our ancient designation of the region as closed, and they had done us the courtesy of treating that designation seriously, and now they were asking us, formally and respectfully, to tell them why. And if the why could not be given, if the closure was, as they gently suggested it might be, an old superstition that had outlived its cause, then they asked our blessing to do what every young and growing people has always done with an old and unexplained prohibition, which is to test it. I was not in the chamber when the petition was first heard. I was below, where I always was, but word came down, as word always comes down, traveling from level to level on the soft feet of keepers carrying messages too important to entrust to anything but a living mouth, and by the time it reached me it had the particular weight that only true things have. The Ior wished to open the stillward. The keeping was divided. And the eldest had asked, as the eldest always asks when the keeping is divided, whether there was anything in the lower vaults that bore on the question. There was. I had spent 200 years pretending there was not, and now there was, and the pretense was over, and I found this surprised me, that I was relieved. A burden you have carried alone for 2 centuries becomes, in some terrible way, a companion, and I had not realized how heavy the silence had grown until I was finally permitted to set it down. I sent word up that the keeper of the 9th vault wished to address the eldest on the matter of the stillward, and that what he had to say should be heard below, in the lower vaults, where the relevant record could not be moved. They came down to me. That is not nothing. The eldest of the keeping had not descended past the level of the first treaties in longer than I had been alive, and the descent took most of a day, the old one moving slowly down through the cooling air with 2 attendants at either side, pausing at each level to rest, and I think to remember. I met them at the threshold of the under seal. I had prepared nothing, because there was nothing to prepare. The entry would speak for itself, as it had spoken to me, and either they would understand or they would not, and I no longer had the strength to make them understand by any means but the truth. We moved the stone. It took the 4 of us, myself and the 2 attendants, and, to my surprise, the eldest, who put a thin hand against the cold mass of it and pushed with the rest of us, which is a thing I will remember when I have forgotten almost everything else. And then the entry lay open in the still air of the under seal. And I read it aloud in the long reckoning, and I set its date against the history of the sky, and I watched the oldest living member of my order understand the thing that I had understood 200 years before, and grow, if it is possible, even stiller than the still air around us. The eldest was quiet for a long time. When the old one finally spoke, it was not to me, and it was not about the entry. It said, almost to itself, that in 11,000 years of keeping it had believed that the lowest entries in the underseal were the records of the oldest things, that the deeper you went, the further back you reached, the closer you came to the first thing any keeper ever thought worth keeping. And it had just understood, it said, that this was wrong. That at least one entry in the underseal was not a record of the oldest thing. It was a record of a thing that had not yet happened when the record was made. And that meant the underseal was not the floor of memory after all. It meant something stood below the floor and had reached up through it and had written. We did not speak of who. There was no profit in it, and there was a great deal of danger, and we were both old enough to know the difference. But I will tell you what I have come to think in the years since, in the cold hours when the seals are renewed and there is nothing to do but think. I do not think the oldest keeper wrote that entry. I do not think any keeper wrote it. I think the keeping found it. I think that at some unimaginable depth of the past, the first of us, the very first hand ever to keep a record, came upon a warning already written, in a place already sealed against a thing that did not yet exist, and did the only thing a keeper can do with a true and terrible record, which is to keep it, to build a vault over it, to set a stone upon it, to pass down, hand to hand across the whole age of the galaxy, not the warning itself but the discipline of leaving it sealed. We did not make the still word forbidden. We inherited the forbidding from something that forbade it before we were, and we have been keeping that prohibition so faithfully for so long that we forgot we did not write it. That is what I think. I have never said it aloud until now, and I am only saying it now because the saying can no longer do harm. The harm is already done. The keeping convened. It is a slow thing, the convening of the keeping. We do nothing quickly, and a matter of this weight moved with the particular reluctance of a great mass changing direction. While we convened, the Ior waited, with a patience I knew they could not sustain forever. Resh Talavar came down twice more to the upper vaults, always correct, always respectful, and each time I saw her she had grown a little thinner, a little more pressed, and I understood that she was waiting not only on us but on her own people, who were younger and hotter than she was, and who did not see why an old order's silence should be permitted to stand athwart a tide that had crossed half the sky. I asked to be permitted to speak to her. It was irregular. A keeper of the lower vaults does not treat with petitioners. But the eldest permitted it, I think because the old one had seen the same thing in her that I had, the honor and the strain and the dreadful narrowing of her options, and hoped, as I hoped, that one honest voice might do what the whole slow machinery of the keeping could not. I told her the truth, not the contents of the entry, that was sealed and is sealed and will remain sealed while I have breath to keep it, but I told her the shape of the truth, which is sometimes more frightening than the substance. I told her that the closure of the still word was not a superstition. I told her that it was the oldest deliberate act the keeping could point to, older than the keeping itself, and that we had maintained it not out of ignorance, but out of a knowledge so old we could no longer locate its source. I told her that the entry which closed the region was dated before the region's worlds had formed, and I watched her try to fit that fact into a mind that had been built, like all young minds, on the assumption that a warning must come after the thing it warns of, and I watched the fact refuse to fit, and I watched her decide, gently, regretfully, with real sorrow, that I must be mistaken, that the date must be an error, that a record old enough to be wrong about its own age was old enough to be wrong about everything, and that her people could not be asked to halt at the edge of the largest unexplored sky in the galaxy on the strength of an error, in an archive that no living thing could verify. I did not blame her. I do not blame her now. She was doing what a good envoy does, which is to find the most honorable available reason to do the thing her people have already decided to do. And her people had decided. I understood that fully only when she told me, with the particular flatness that honest people use when they are ashamed of their own message, that the ascendancy had not waited for the keeping's answer, that a survey expedition had already been dispatched, that it was, even as we spoke in the cool upper vaults with the soft sounds of keepers moving around us, crossing the line that the charts had refused to cross for the whole age of the galaxy, going to find out what was inside. I will not tell you that I knew what would happen. That would be a lie, and I have not lied in this account and will not begin now. I did not know. The entry does not say what is in the stillword. It says only that the region is closed, and against whom, and what they did. And the what they did is described in a grammar so old and so spare that I have read it 10,000 times, and could not tell you whether it describes a people or a weapon or a tide or a single act repeated, until it became a property of the place. I did not know what the Ior survey would find. I knew only that the line had held for longer than there had been anyone to hold it, and that it had not held by accident, and that a thing which has been forbidden across the entire age of the galaxy by something that forbade it before the galaxy's youngest stars were born is not a thing one tests lightly. The keeping reached its decision while the survey was still en route. The decision was the one I knew it would be, the one it had always been going to be, the one it had in some sense made before any of us were born. The designation stood. The stillword was closed and would remain closed, and the keeping would lend no blessing and no aid to any attempt to open it, and would record. This is the only weapon the keeping has, and it is a slower and stranger weapon than the young powers understand. Would record that the prohibition had been reaffirmed, and by whom, and against whose petition, so that when the Ior ascendancy had risen and crested and fallen, as all tides fall, there would remain in the vaults a true account of the moment they were warned and chose to go anyway. We do not stop anyone. We have never stopped anyone. We only remember, and being remembered correctly is a thing the young do not fear nearly enough. The eldest descended one last time to the underseal, to witness the resealing with its own eyes, because the old one said, and I have thought about this a great deal, that a seal renewed without a witness is only maintenance. But a seal renewed before a witness is a vow, and the keeping owed the entry a vow. So we lowered the stone together, the four of us, and I set the seal with my own hand as I had set it 10,000 times, and the eldest watched, and the still air of the underseal closed over the oldest warning in the galaxy as it had closed over it across the whole unbroken age of our keeping. And it was then, in the last moment before the stone settled, that I saw the thing I have not told the keeping, and will not, and am telling you only because you cannot reach the underseal and could not turn the key if you held it. The entry had been amended. I know that entry. I have known it for 200 years. I have renewed its seal more times than I have renewed any other thing in the lower vaults, and I know its every stroke the way I know the inside of my own eyelids, every mark of the oldest hand laid down before there was a human star to warn against. And in the last moment before the stone came down, in the cold light, I saw that there was a stroke upon it that had not been there before. A single mark in the same medium, in a hand that was not the oldest hand and was not my hand, and was not any hand in the keeping, living or recorded, that I have ever learned to read. It was fresh. The medium of the underseal does not take fresh marks. It has not taken a new stroke in longer than the sail have existed. It is the most stable thing we keep, which is why the oldest warning was set down on it. And there was a fresh mark upon it, made beneath a stone that takes four of us to move, in a sealed level at the bottom of a vault that no living thing enters but the keepers of the ninth, in a hand none of us has ever written. I do not know what it says. It is a single mark, and a single mark in the oldest grammar is not a word but a modifier. It does not state, it adjusts. It turns the meaning of what stands beside it the way a single tone turns the meaning of a phrase. I have spent the years since trying not to think about what it adjusts. The entry says the stillword is closed against its inhabitants and describes what they did. The fresh mark stands beside the date. And the only meaning I have been able to find for it, in all the cold hours of all the years since, The only reading that the oldest grammar will bear is the one I cannot unsee and have never spoken until this sentence. It is the mark that turns a record of the past into a record of the future. It does not say the inhabitants of the stillward did this thing. It says they will. The IOR survey did not return. I want to be precise, because precision is the last honesty left to me. It did not fail to return the way expeditions fail, with a final distress signal and a silence after. There was no battle. I have seen the records the ascendancy permitted us, and there is no battle in them, no enemy, no weapon, nothing the IOR could name or aim at or even properly fear. There were only the survey's own transmissions, regular and calm and competent, crossing the line, charting the empty approaches, finding the region exactly as unremarkable as a young and rational people would expect an old superstition to be, and then, with no break and no alarm and no change in the steady professional voice of the reports, fewer of them. Then fewer. Then the long reckoning of silence, which is the only reckoning the stillward has ever answered in. The ascendancy sent others to learn what had become of the first. It is what young powers do. The charts of the stillward grew, for a little while, denser and more frightened at their edge, the cramped, anxious hand of cartographers who cannot stop writing crowding closer and closer to a line they will not cross again. And then they stopped, as they have always stopped at the line, and the region beyond went back to being unmarked, and the IOR ascendancy began, in the slow way of tides, to draw back from the beach. Resh Talavar came to me once more after. She was very thin by then and very quiet, and she did not ask me anything, which is how I knew she finally understood. She only said that her people would no longer seek to open the stillward, and that she had come to ask whether the keeping would record that they had stopped, so that the account would be complete. I told her it would. It is the only mercy we have to give, and we give it freely. We will remember that you were warned, and we will also remember that in the end you listened. It is not much. To the young it seems like nothing. But I have kept records for 900 years, and I have learned that to be remembered as one who finally listened is not nothing, and that there are far worse things to be the last line of, and that some of those worse things are sealed beneath stones at the bottom of vaults, waiting in a grammar older than the things they describe for the date that turns them true. I have sealed this account. I have written it in my own hand in the upper vaults where the living come, so that it can be read, because the shape of the truth should be available even where the substance must not be. But I have set my own seal upon it, and the seal is the kind we use for a record that is complete and must not be amended, and I have done that for a reason I will give you plainly, since I have given you everything else plainly. I have seen what it looks like when an entry that was complete is amended anyway, beneath a stone no living hand can lift, in a hand none of us can read, after the seal was set. I do not believe my seal will protect this account from that. I do not believe anything protects anything from that. But I have set it anyway, because setting it is the discipline I was given, and the discipline is the only thing I have ever been able to keep that something older did not reach up through the floor and keep first. The stillward is closed. It was closed before it could be entered. It was forbidden against its inhabitants, before its worlds, before its sun. I do not know who they are. I have never seen one. No record I keep has ever held an image of them, a name they gave themselves, a word in their own voice. They exist in the vaults only as the thing the warning warns against, the cause at the head of the oldest closure, the inhabitants of the still place that does not answer. And I have come at last to the end of my pretending, which lasted 200 years, and which I am glad to be done with. And I will set down the only conclusion my 900 years have left me, and then I will set the stone. The most dangerous thing in any archive is a date, and the most dangerous date I have ever kept is one that has not yet come. The warning is older than the thing it warns of. The record knew first. And somewhere beneath the floor of the oldest memory the galaxy possesses, in a hand we have never written, something is still keeping its own account of us, and it has already added the mark that turns our past into our future, and sealed it, and is waiting, with a patience that makes mine look like haste, for the line to be crossed by the ones the warning was always, always for. I keep the silence, I set the stone,